Hi, this is Leslie. I wanted to share a little bit about mindset for starting this course, starting this community based on improving our relationships and bringing more health to our relational dynamics and health within ourself. And I want to share, like, my philosophy is that in order to improve our relationships, we need to focus first on the relationship we have with ourself and build our self-knowledge. That's number one, because without self-knowledge and self-awareness, then we are basically walking into relationship problems, guaranteed. Okay. Because we all have a subconscious patterning around relational attachment. And this occurs very early on. I mean, from birth, probably before birth, based on how our mothers took care of us in utero and how stressed out she was and all the physiological things that affected our development, were part of creating us. And then we have, the epigenetic piece of things where there's more and more evidence to show that we are inheriting psycho-emotional spiritual patterns of our ancestors, not only our immediate parents, but their parents' experience and on back in time. So nobody's immune, right, from relationship dysfunction, honestly, in my opinion. I think that it's not taught how to create healthy attachments and create relationships. It's something that's really seriously missing in our culture, for sure, here in the US, and I think in much of Europe as well, and other places in the world. So the mindset is important as we go forward. And it's very important that we have two elements here that I'm going to mention today. The first is compassion, okay? Compassion for ourselves, compassion for the people that impacted us throughout our lives. And that doesn't mean saying that what people did was right. And this brings us into this concept of blame and responsibility. So, in addition to having compassion as a key element in your mindset, in your heart approach, heart-based approach with people and yourself, there's something very key and important about taking personal responsibility for yourself and for whatever has happened to you and for all of the patterns of your life. Okay. Whether or not, we created them, because things that happen to us when we're infants and children clearly are not our responsibility. But it is our responsibility now to figure out what to do about them, to figure out what was the excuse me, what was the damage that was caused by that, or what were just the blind spots and the patterns that are programmed into us because we don't know better. We don't know what we don't know. And that's a really big deal. And what I see happening a lot in the world, and I think in the context of relationships, is a desire to blame, to hold, people like the idea of holding responsibility, but it's very much with a pointing a finger, like you need to take responsibility for what you did to me, And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about getting someone else to do anything or or getting someone else to change. It's more about recognizing that we have a lot of power internally. And through working on ourselves, we will have impact on our surroundings, on our relationships. Excuse me for a moment. Get that ugly thing off the screen. Okay, so personal responsibility, and that's really the base, the only place you can start is you took responsibility for clicking a button that joined a group. Okay, now it's up to you what happens next. So I think that there is a hurtful pattern. I see it a lot in the world around pointing fingers, blaming groups of people, blaming others, developing an identity around your wounds, creating labels around your dysfunction. And that's not where I come from. That's not how I approach things. Because I think the idea of finding blame, this need to find blame is part of the trauma wound. It's only a phase. It's not indicative of healing. It's not the ending point. And what happens with blame a lot of the time is this idea of kind of revenge or compensation. And it puts oneself in this victim mindset that I've been wronged, and you're responsible, and you need to pay me something to compensate for my wounds. Our society is so litigious, right? So legal. And that fear of lawsuit and so forth, and the risk of, like creating adversarial relationships in court, that is problem in our world. And it's a big problem in relationships. And you can really see it in family court. You can see it in custody battles. There's very much this me against you, you're the problem. And those battles can go on for years, years and years. And you know who gets hurt the most are the kids. So it is really important to figure out, how do you come to terms with your anger and your hurt, and transmute this into a place of personal empowerment and personal grounding and confidence, to be able to trust yourself to do what needs to be done for the greatest, the good of your family, your children, yourself, and without and to do so without being like blaming, because that attitude of blame is not going to bring around peace in any relationship. It's not going to bring harmony. It's not going to bring cooperation. It's not going to bring real closure. And so people just stay in this ick place for long periods of time. And, I'll say that with my children's father, he held on to bitterness so long, so long. And he couldn't even respond to a neutral text from me without, paragraphs, let's say, of condemnation, and blame. And it was poisonous. It was poisonous for me. It was poisonous for my children. And so it's very easy for me to kind of well, he this or that, right? But that isn't, and then there's some truth. Like, we can describe a story and we can do so honestly. And I think that's really important. Let's think about it in the context of, let's say, your parents or someone who abused you. And we can feel a lot of anger, a lot of righteous anger, a lot of clarity about wrongdoing. And that can be like a poison that just grows and fills your soul. It's not bringing you peace when you stay in that place. And so this idea of blame, revenge really goes along with feeling victimized, feeling powerless, feeling small, helpless, right? And that's not what we want to promote here. That's not our goal. But we do want to feel the feelings. We want to acknowledge the truth of the situation and not sugarcoat the damage or the hurt to you, your children, whoever was affected. So we need to learn how to process anger. I've held on to anger, and sometimes it takes time to figure out how to process and metabolize anger. In our culture, women and anger are often conflictual, right? Like, women have a hard time with anger. They're told good girls don't get angry, always be a good girl, be nice, be sweet, right? And the word nice actually has etymology around being foolish. And so sometimes being nice is foolish. And yet, what's the alternative? What do we do? How do we minimize conflict? How do we avoid, escalation of fighting or whatever it might be? That's a dilemma that a lot of us have been in. how do we get through these tense, volatile situations potentially without joining in and adding to the bad of it all. So that comes back to us. It comes back to us figuring out what to do with our own experiences and how to process our own emotion, and then how to proceed forward in a way that is the most clear and the most affirming, right, for yourself, but also that holds some space for the humanness of the other person, and to be able to see things with perspective and not dump our bitterness and our anger on other people. So those are two important things. I think I wanted to add two around this idea of blame, revenge, that I think underneath that is shame. And we sometimes feel or hold on to a sense of inappropriate responsibility, like inaccurate self-blame for things that happened to us when we were, 3 years old and didn't know better and didn't have any control over that situation. So there's a lot of scripts that subconsciously get created from the dynamics of our early childhood experiences that plants a seed around our identity back in our mind. Usually it's below consciousness, that it has something to do with not being good enough, being the problem, needing to fix it. And when we have that script, then we often end up in codependent relationships. We end up being a rescuer. We end up tolerating, behaviors that aren't safe, healthy, or good for us. So there is a need here to reflect on our childhood experiences, our relational experiences starting from birth, with our parents, with any caregivers that we were raised by, with any adults who abused us, any older siblings, things like that. What we witnessed, what we had as role modeling for relationships, that's important. And any traumas that occurred that created a frozen spot inside our system, or a wiring towards fight or flight, or freeze, or fawn. And we'll get into more of these terms later. Many of you understand the basics of trauma and the impact on the system, but not everybody. And I'd like to be able to get more into that and how it applies to you. Because it's one thing to understand something conceptually or intellectually. We can analyze it, we can understand it with our, frontal lobes, our left brain. But that is not enough to change our emotional experience or even our behavior. I'm sure that you can all think of a time when kind of you knew better, when you saw the problem and you're like, okay, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to lose my temper, when XYZ condition happens, I'm going to stay calm. And then you get sucked right into it, and next thing you know, you're like reacting, yelling. Okay, those are things that are bypassing the frontal lobes, bypassing the thinking brain. So we need to look into that stuff and figure out, how do we access the subconscious? How do we figure out what scripts are driving us? How do we step out of this idea of blame and shame and holding other people accountable, when really where we have our power is in what we do and what we choose. And this has a lot to do with communication, which is a challenge for many. Has a lot to do with even knowing who you are, what you want, what's important to you, what's your vision, your purpose. Has a lot to do with figuring out what makes a good partner. Just being really attracted to somebody doesn't mean that they're a good partner. And I see a lot of people rushing forward into commitments when they don't really know what they're getting into, where they haven't explored their alignment around values, for example, or lifestyle, or the vision that you share, So there's a lot here that we can get into. So I don't want to ramble because I can really ramble and go off on a lot of tangents. So this video really is just to bring you to this mindset of compassion and personal responsibility. And that when you're frustrated with other people, you're frustrated with yourself, notice the condemning voices. Notice all the shit talk that's going on in your head, all the blame, all the shaming, the critical voice, the perfectionist. We all have these parts that are coming up in unique ways for us. And that's what our kind of challenge is to be a private eye of our own consciousness. Kind of it's a sleuth to solve. And it's fun. It's interesting when you think of it like that. It's like, oh, I want to learn about myself. And I want to figure out like what pushes my buttons. And what about this situation, this sentence somebody said, or the tone in the voice, or the lack of eye contact, or whatever it is that is like setting us off. We want to dig deeper into ourself rather than just be like, you gave me a dirty look, right? Not helpful, not going to solve the problem, superficial. Okay, this is about going deeper than just behavioral rules and that kind of thing. We want to get a deep understanding, and we want to learn mastery of ourselves more and more so. And, that's a lifelong path. And that's a spiritual path as well. So we will be blending mind, body, spirit. We will be seeking alignment between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. We will be exploring our moral compass and what is right and wrong. And what do we do when people do wrong things? And what's the difference between doing a wrong thing and just doing something that is different than what we value? Because there is a difference. And that's where we often get into dilemmas, right? And we need to ask ourselves, where is our limit for, how much are we willing to settle? That's a phrase that's common, don't settle. Well, what does that mean? And are we holding out for perfection? Is that a way of being avoidant on some level? We'll talk about attachment styles, how those are created, how do we recognize our attachment issues? What do we do with them? How do we recognize attachment issues in the dynamic that includes another person? Because that's when things get really complicated. So I'm excited to talk about all these topics with you, and I'll end here, and I look forward to your questions. Keep commenting, ask questions, and share stories. Thank you.